I'm going to introduce a couple of methods. Would you call them tools? Maybe. Certainly some beliefs, approaches, ways of thinking. We do have one exercise or a couple exercises for you to do together that will give you a sense of tuning into your own sense of network leadership, but also how you're going to spur that in others. So just to manage those expectations in terms of actual tools, what you're going to get. So I want to say that I think one of the things about networks is that they really are everywhere. And networks have been around for a long time. There are formal and informal networks. And I think with the advent of technology and the internet, suddenly we've been able to make the invisible visible. And from that, we've been able to learn a lot about networks and how they form, what things we can do to make them more vibrant, more generative, more self-organizing. And so I'm going to give you the quick intro today about, what are networks and how do they work, and what role can you take in paying attention to them. And I will say that ONN really is a model of a network of networks networks, as we get into it, you will see, are really clusters within clusters. And sometimes we span the boundaries between those networks, and sometimes we don't do such a good job at that. So how we intentionally find those opportunities and reach out across those boundaries or open your boundaries, working in some looser and more open ways, can really make a huge difference in terms of how you do your work and actually make the nonprofit sector a stronger and more vibrant place to be. So, why work in networks? Well, here are some reasons. Usually the problem or opportunity is really big. And when we're looking at making policy changes in Ontario, those are big problems or big challenges that you're working on. You need some new ideas. So, having the same old around the table, what does Albert Einstein, how does he define the definition of driving yourself crazy? What is it? Insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to get different results, right? So you need new ideas, you need new people. The solution is often not clear, or you need to build a new system around that. So as we heard earlier today from Kathy, we're going to vet it, then we're going to go out and talk to people. How do we get clear on what was this really issue? What possible solutions are out there? What things have people been trying already? Don't just assume we're going to start something new. We may uncover really great practices right in front of us that we just didn't even know. And if you're in a highly connected network, you're way more likely to uncover those and know about them and have them communicated back through the network. And you need to engage people from different backgrounds. So again, I heard Kathy talk about all the different parts of the not-for-profit sector and all the different interests, beliefs, cultural aspects of that. I think the more difference you bring in, the more likely you're going to have innovative breakthroughs, going to come together novel recombinations. So this is key. I want to also say that, and I already heard this today, and you're probably going to hear it from Marilyn, who's at the table in other ways, networks and the challenges that we're facing today are really big, complex problems. And if you're working inside those systems for change, the qualities of those things, it's not logical. You don't start with A and go to B and go to C. You suddenly end up at J. And how did you get there? Because it's these multiple small non-linear interactions that really make a difference. And it's those patterns of relating that can really help you see and understand where you're getting to the outcome. So if you think about the problems you're working on right now, and you think about all the people who are involved in making a difference on that issue, let's pick violence against women. So think of everyone involved in that system, everything that we're all doing, everything that happens every day, and we look at our current outcome in terms of the number of women who are impacted by that issue, is it good enough? I would argue no. We got room to improve there. So how are we going to start doing things differently, engaging more people, more ideas, finding better ways to go? Any one of the issues that all of you work on, you could think like that. And then start turning to your networks and think, how do we begin to engage that on a broader scale? The one other thing I'll say about networks is, for me, I really think that they're the natural system within the sort of like the scaffold that holds everything together. So it's the people and the connections between them, and then the ideas, resources, opportunities that flow through those networks. And the degree to which people have access to the things that are flowing through, it's equitable. But if you've got people on your edges and you're not paying attention to how you're engaging and including those, then you've got issues of access of equity. It's a different way of thinking than just slicing and dicing your demographic data. You're actually looking at a map and thinking, where are people? For the last 2 days, we had June Hawley here. She is one of the leading experts in this work. She coined the phrase network weaver. She's written this fantastic book called The Network Weaver's Handbook. She's brilliant, and she describes herself as an old hippie. I'm just an old hippie. She's very funny. But she really has had incredible influence in this work. And this is a quote from her, which I find very powerful. "Systems change when new networks supplant the old." Let's just think about that in terms of who's holding the power, how the networks, who's making decisions within networks, what networks you are a part of or not a part of, and what it would look like if you started creating a network that was going to advance the things that you believe are the right things to be doing for your sector and the people in it and in your communities. So I also want to go to the private sector for a minute and talk about some really important trends that a person named Fred Wilson, who I believe is a very influential person, he was tweeting yesterday about how all the venture capitalists are burning through their capital too fast right now. If you look him up on Twitter, you'll see some things that he's talking about. He works at something called Union Square Venture Capitalists. He's been, on the ground investing first time on things like Twitter and, Uber and all the big new, developments of networks. And he gives a talk, which you can find on YouTube if you search his name, Fred Wilson. That he gave in just a little bit less than a year ago. And I found it so influential. And he talked about these 3 big trends. And if things aren't in, like he doesn't invest in big data and he doesn't invest in a bunch of other things, he just invests in things that are touching on one of these 3 trends, usually a bunch of them all together. And those 3 big trends are these things. The huge shift from hierarchical, bureaucratic organizations to networked, technology-enabled, distributed organizations or networks, basically. So a much looser, flatter kind of thing, usually with technology enabling. And he's very honest and clear about the fact that hierarchical, bureaucratic organizations were the most efficient way for so many years to organize yourselves. You were needed to be geographically located. You needed to have ways of moving things efficiently through your organization. So that, top-down structure and all of the way we organize ourselves, that's the way it needed to work. But not anymore. And so he gives example of how different organizations are shifting into this new networked way. You think about your own organization, how people may have started working more distributed kinds of ways, more virtual kinds of learning, all kinds of, you'll see the touch of that already in your organization. He talks about the great unbundling. So in the past, it was efficient for newspapers to have everything all in the same package. From classifieds to headlines to feature stories to covering the arts, covering sports, covering business. Today's consumer, they want sports. They want stuff. They want whatever. Like they're going to just pick and choose the things that they want. Think about your cable, right? You don't want to buy all of those things. There's a great unbundling. He talks about the banking business. He's investing in entrepreneurs, as he says, that they're picking off the businesses out of banking and really going deep on those in a distributed way where the smaller, lighter, faster organizations can't compete with these much bigger, slower banks. Right? So this is a big trend, and it's coming, and it's continuing. And finally, he talks about you are a node on the network. So how many of you in here have a smartphone with you? You're a node on the network. Okay? We know where you are. Things are happening. Some of you might want to read that Greenwald book about Snowden. Pretty interesting. And not that I'm going to go there today, but it's Uber. It's all about who needs to drive, who's got a car. There you go. And that's sort of the future of where things are happening. So networks are enabling all of that. So this is the kind of big picture that's going on out there in terms of these big trends, and it's in that context that I'm going to talk to you about network leadership. and why I think every one of the people in this room needs to be thinking about how are you a leader in the network and what can you do to help encourage that leadership in others. So here's a little bit about what do networks actually look like and how are they structured. So this slide describes the difference between moving from that kind of top-down to leading from within. So if you're going to describe a network, your organization in an organizational chart, you're going to see that one on the right-hand side. If you look at a network lens, it's a much more distributed kind of thing. And I'll give you a clue. If you do a network drawing and you've got an organization that has a lot of hubs and spokes in it, you're probably still pretty hierarchical. So you'll see another drawing in a minute that's a smart network where there's a lot of clustering in the center and not just individual hubs and spokes. So what's the difference between a network and an organization? So here are some qualities that really show how there's this shift between the two. So in an organization, you're either in the organization or you're out of the organization. And in a network, there's very loose boundaries. In an organization, there's usually a very clear chain of command. In a network, lots of people, clusters of people can have, take up leadership and then drop it and pass it on to others. People are usually assigned tasks. In networks, people often assume tasks. I'll leave this. I'm not going to go through every one, but you get the sense, you get the drift in terms of the difference between the two. I think the thing to remember about it is that it's not either or. And many of you, as you're thinking about this work, are probably both members of organizations or staff in organizations or volunteers in organizations, and or you may be members of networks, formal and informal. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between formal and informal. And you may find how you act and engage in that network kind of structure, you're going to feel a little understanding of that relative to how you might be in your organization. But I'm also going to put the challenge to you is how do you loosen up your organization a little bit to be more like a networked organization? So let's just talk about what makes up a network. Just the technical bits of it if no one's ever thought about networks before. So the nodes, those are the little squares, those are the people in the network. The links, the thing between, those are the relationships and connections. And the arrows show, when you do a mapping like this, I know Marilyn, but Marilyn also knows me. So we would have an arrow going back and forth, right? So, but someone out there might know me, but I might not know you. So that you would draw an arrow just one way. So there's a bit of a directional flow. And obviously, if there's a mutual thing, that's a stronger connection. So June Hawley and Valdis Krebs did this research early on, probably about 10 years ago, where they looked at like 500 different organizations and networks, and they looked at the different patterns, and they came up with this notion of smart networks. And a smart network is defined as one that has a very dense cluster in the center, which is light here, but there'll be more pictures coming, so it'll make more sense, and a very broad periphery, so about 5 to 7 times the size of that core. So you've got lots of diversity on the edges. And we think about smart networks for dealing with those complex problems, those network of networks idea, because they increase communication and awareness of relationships. So in that dense core, you don't need to know everybody, but it's only 1 or 2 steps to get to the people, and there's lots of trust there. So you quickly say, oh, you got to talk to this person, and you're going to answer the phone when that person phones. You're open to new resources because that periphery is very diverse and new things are coming in. Again, minimal steps to get to 1, 2, 3 into the center, and then that's going to start spreading around. You expand and support leadership. So lots of people taking leadership, and recognizing something that needs to be done and stepping up. In fact, June told the story about Occupy Sandy, which I didn't know about this before. But remember last year when Manhattan was hit with that horrendous Hurricane Sandy, the people who had been involved in Occupy previously showed up, especially in an area called the Rockaways. And they started doing organizing. They got 50,000 volunteers down there, distributing food, visiting people in high-rises. They, FEMA, Red Cross, they were just not even on the scene. And they started by bringing people into the community and then quickly rallied and self-organized the people in the community themselves. And she had this amazing story that she told at the workshop, but we don't have time to go into the detail of that today. But it just gives you an idea of how quickly networks can do that. And the people who had the experience from Occupy brought it together. She calls it Occupy Sandy. It's very interesting. So expanding and supporting that leadership. Encourage collaboration, innovation, and learning for breakthroughs. So in these networks, you can create that novel recombination, you create those opportunities, you can catch things that are happening where something in the community is no longer working or has moved into that kind of creative destruction. We talked about that eco-cycle of the forming, growing to maturity, something's moving into creative destruction, and then rebirth, novel recombination. So in that way, you've got within a network ways of knowing and hearing and being aware of how those things happen, and you can gather people and be thinking strategically about how to seize on those opportunities. And finally, you can increase inclusion and bridge divides. So finding ways to span those boundaries and work in more strategic kinds of ways. So smart networks enable all of these kinds of outcomes. There you go. Results in better outcomes. Okay, next thing. So how do smart networks form? Smart networks form usually by recognizing that there are fragments out there. So if you go back to the beginning of the story of how ONN started, right? So starting to think about, well, what if we made it a network, and who's already out there, and how do we start to weave that together? So you see those fragments out there, you bring them together, and probably in that initial stage, you had that initial hub and spoke. So there was a few of you in the center with that idea. And then you started in that constellation kind of way, beginning to create those different clusters out there and identifying people who are already working and were leading in those areas, bringing those together. And as you weave those networks with intentional actions as network weavers, that's what network leadership is all about, you get into this core and periphery kind of structure. So that happens over time, and there are intentional things you can always be doing about how to weave those pieces. So you think about any network that you're in right now. Who's in the center? How many clusters are there? How could you make that richer? What does that look like? And then, you know, who are some unusual suspects that you can be drawing in? That's going to get that periphery much more diverse. So you're going to bring different perspectives in, which really help people to make learning breakthroughs and find new ways of doing things. So I'm not going to dwell on this because these are the characteristics of smart networks. So that core is very dense. There's lots of overlapping clusters and projects of things that are happening. That periphery is very broad and includes a broad range of people. And the quality of the connections is high. So there's trust building, especially in that core. Right? Here's another way to look at it. So just pull that, I'm just going to go back for a sec, that network in there, you're like, what's really in there? So here's another way to look at it, just to draw it out a little bit. You can see a bunch of these projects that are going on. They're all cross-connected to each other. And you know, you can see within that, those self-organizing project, people identifying things that they want to work on, right? And surface, and are sharing across. So as action happens, that ideas and actions happen across through that. And within that larger network, you can see that there is this kind of informal network. So that's your whole collection of all of the relationships that you have out there. And some subset of that is an intentional network like ONN, so for the focus on the not-for-profit sector, with that formal piece in it. So what does that look like if we kind of unpack that? Well, here's a way to kind of understand it. So if we sort of pulled apart the different bits in that core, there's all these different things that are happening within that. There are a few people that really have a view across. So these are people who are connectors. There are some people who are attending to the way that the network communicates and looks after itself and gathering data about it, so the network guardians. There are people who are generating projects and are looking for others to get involved in those projects, actually doing stuff within that network, and those are like project coordinator types. So we're going to do an exercise in a minute or two about who in the room here, what kind of network weavers you are, and what kinds of skills you currently have and things that you might want to work on in the future. We're going to do a little bit more content before that, before we get to that. And on this, I'm now going to move you just into a quick buzz at your tables with some questions about thinking about what projects that have you been a part of that have brought people together who, have not worked together before. What's it been like to be a part of a network? What's worked for you with that? And finally, how does it make you think about your own work differently as you think about these network ideas?